Okay, so welcome everybody. Very efficiently, after the election in Norway, a Norwegian scholar here, Marte Mangset. We're going to talk about subtle shifts in sectorial power and party affinities, post-ministerial careers in Norway from 65 to 2021. So Marte is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Oslo, and also, not least important, and since 2024, director of the sectorial universitaire, the Norvège at Paris. And that's something we won't talk about now, but later. And she got her PhD in sociology in 2009 through a joint program between University of Bergen and Sciences Po in Paris. And this dissertation was the discipline of historians, a comparative study of historians' construction of the discipline of history in English, French, and Norwegian universities. And your research, Martin's research, centers on international comparative qualitative sociology, particularly the intersection of knowledge, education, and power. And she has published a lot of papers on that and on representativity bland norska regeringsmedlemmar mellan 45 och 23. Var det korrekt?
Absolutely.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to come here. Over the years, I've heard about the Institute, not only when I met you in Paris, but also from Jenny Andersson, that I know from Sciences Po, and from Anna, which recently took part in a PhD course, summer school, that we organized in France, and Stefan Svalfors, who said he couldn't be here today, but I've been in touch with him over the years due to common research interests. So it's really nice to...
I actually think he's in Norway.
He is in Norway, he says. Yes, he did it. But I'll meet him in Paris later this year, so it'll be fine. Anyway, it's really nice to actually come here to your institute and meet new people, and well, thank you for that. And as Gustav said, I am normally working more qualitatively and much international comparatively, but this particular paper that I'm presenting today will be slightly different. But after thinking it over, I found that this might be very appropriate, both due to the recent elections and to interests here at the center. And also because I'm in the middle of it. It's a paper that we're finishing up or working on, and hopefully will submit in some time. Okay. I'm writing the study I'm talking about today. I'm doing together with Jostein Askim, who's at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo, and Lisa Veldehanna, who's at the same place. So this is part of a larger project that we're having on the cabinet governments in Norway. It's called Politex and funded by the Research Council Norway. It's combining scholars and approaches from political science, sociology, law, and history. And this is rather important because sometimes they don't have exactly the same methodological approach, the theoretical approach, but we think that bringing them together can shed light on what a cabinet government is in new ways. We found that there is rather scarce literature on cabinet governments, and there is a lot of other key political institutions, parliaments, ministries, and so on, but not much on the core executive, often for rather good reasons, since it's sometimes hard to access, it's secret, it's important people who won't get interviewed and so on. But the good thing about the Nordic countries is that you have a different kind of access to ministers and so on compared to many other countries. So actually the Nordic countries are kind of a good place to start if you want to understand really the inner workings of cabinet governments. So we have based our study on a range of types of data. So it's both, we have made interviews with, I don't know, maybe 3/4 of the ministers of the last cabinet governments. And we also have access to interviews with former governments back to the 60s and the 50s and so on. So we have a wide range of interviews. We also, of course, have lots of archival data, documents, etc., and statistical data. And we look at how decisions are made, the relationship between the bureaucracy and the elected politicians, the core executives. We look at the development of formal and informal norms of how cabinet government is done. We look at some from the most of what we do is from after the post-war period, but for instance, I'm working on a paper together with Jostein on the development of meritocratic norms for hiring and the rules for how politicians are allowed to take part in hirings in the top administrative position from 1660 up till today. And we also look at modes of coordination, such as the development of the Prime Minister's office, and also the subjective experiences of work. What's day-to-day life for a minister? So all this is, we have this in a, we published a book last year, Regjeringen. It's in Norwegian for the time being. Now we're working on the English-speaking publications, but we wanted a big Norwegian book for students and so on. So that's kind of an overview. So for those of you who are Scandinavian speakers, it's possible to look at that. But today I want to focus on the ministerial careers. And you often hear about these things, I suppose. So often we talk about people like this one, Jon Georg Dale. He was a minister when he got off. He went into First House, the PR lobby company. This is the kind of the classical thing that we like to talk about these days, right? How politicians go into that kind of sector. But ministers do other things too. Here's a former actually Minister of Education, of Higher Education. He wasn't very interested in higher education. He was very into oil. He started his own oil company. He actually in the end had to go because he was buying shares in the weapon company while he was a minister and knew everything about Norwegian investments in weapons due to Ukraine. So there was a conflict of interest there. But more common are actually the ones who go into leader positions in public sector, such as fylkesmannen, statsforvaltere. That was a very regular retirement position for ministers, ex-ministers, right? But I don't know, former, we have Tormod Hermansen, who went into Telenor, right? We'll come back to that kind of thing. But there were also people like, there's an SV minister, Bård Vegar Solhjell, who became head of NORAD. It's the Norwegian Agency for Developmental Aid. And then, kind of one of the more surprising ones, it's the far-right minister of finance, very respected minister, although she was part of the far-right party, Progress Party, Siv Jensen. She kind of made a flop, you could say. She's head of the board of some NGO for rescuing people at sea. It's not a very big company, but she did inherit a lot of money, so maybe she doesn't want to work. Anyway, the point is that they're not all success careers. It can be various. And we wanted to kind of show the diversity of types of careers that these ministers have. So today's focus is on the mobility patterns of, among Norwegian ex-ministers. So you can ask, why study that kind of careers, and what kind of literature can it be situated into? Within the sociology of elites that some of you know very well, you have these questions concerning elite circulation. If we go back to Wilfrid Pareto and Mosca and more recently Mills, the idea that when you have a lot of circulation of elites between different sectors of society, it ties those sectors together and makes it possible to make deals and so on and avoid public scrutiny and control, and therefore you can't get a concentration of power. Whereas others like Dahl and Higley said that no, that's not how it is. The elites are clearly distinct and they can control each other and thereby avoid that kind of abuse of power. So elites is not a problem to democracy. In our point of view, this is rather an empirical question. It's not a normative question or a theoretical question. So it's interesting to study the degree of distinctness between sectorial elites and what kind of patterns of circulation that you find between them to figure out in a specific country, in a specific time period, how close are they. The revolving doors literature, sometimes they discuss between each other, but not always. But they're also, in a way, interested in similar questions, but not always formulated in the same way. So there's a question of whether conflict of interest comes up when you go back and forth between sectors. There's the idea of regular capture. If you come from the public sector, you go into the private sector, and you help the private sector get deals, or if you come from the private sector, go into the public sector and you kind of bring with you the ideas of how the public sector want things to be and use that into how you shape politics. There is also the part of the literature that are concerned with if ex-politicians don't have career possibilities after their ministerial spell, for instance, or after a public office, that might deter people from taking up political positions. It might be less attractive to become a politician. So the most talented people or the ones with least resources, economic resources, will be afraid of going into politics because you can be thrown out of government any day. So you need to know that it's possible to get a job afterwards. So that's also a concern. Our research question is very descriptive. It's not answering directly to any of those related to these two literatures, but it's kind of trying to give a basis, a map that we need as a groundwork for further on working on the other questions. So simply, what characterizes the mobility of ex-ministers in Norway between 1961 and 2023? So it's a long period of time. I'll come back to that. And also, like a secondary question, which is possibly slightly more speculative, what can the changes over time in patterns of ex-ministerial mobility, in particular concerning sectors and industry they migrate to, tell us about changes in the landscape of organization that hold and attract power? Which are the organizations where people want to go to? Has that changed over time? Which are the, if we take the idea that the organizations, the sectors and the organizations where ex-ministers want to go to are probably places where they can exert power, or anyway they will bring with them power into them. So it's interesting to map them. Does that change over time? So it's primarily a descriptive paper, but it's descriptions that are lacking and that are necessary to investigate other type of research questions, such as explanatory and so on. There is a burgeoning literature on elites in general, political elites particularly, also in the Nordics, as I've been discussing a lot with Anna, particularly in Denmark, not so much in Sweden, some in Norway, but it's on specific groups, with a specific method. It's not comprehensive, so lots of data lacking. There is some literature on the background and the career track, so there's often a focus on access to lead position related to the kind of education, work experience, class or geography. Are there inequalities in access to get into elite positions, which is very important, but there are lots of people actually working on this, so we want to do something else. So for instance, Nyrup and his group, they have a big project called Path to Power, which is part of a big international project actually, mapping primarily the background and class and so on. And Marte Saga, young PhD students at the Department of Sociology at the University of Oslo, she's also working on that. She's working on both background and the post-ministerial careers. But with even though we look at some similar things, she has this focus on class and the role of class to access in elite positions. But there are also studies of where elites go after the political positions. In the United States, there is the earlier studies by Thiksen. There are lots. I can't bring them all up. I'm just mentioning a few. And the Danish Eggerod has done a lot of revolving doors. But he has some very specific and very interesting questions. But he's really focusing on some causal aspects. So one thing is, are they recruited by the private sector? Which part of the private sector and so on? But he's very interested in, why do the private sector recruit them? What for? What part of their competence is it that they're interested in? What is political? Is it the network? Is it the competence? What kind of competence? Which is very interesting, but not exactly what we're doing. And he's also looking into, or trying to at least draw out of what his findings show. Do they use their positions to actually lobby or not? Which is not what we're looking at. There are several very interesting Nordic studies, particularly by Christoph Ellerskar and Anton Grau Larsen, who are at the Copenhagen Business School, who have done these big mappings of the Danish power elite, looking much at formal and informal ties between elite groups. So there is also this interest in the cohesion of elites across sectors, but not necessarily so much based on whether they circulate, but much more on are they in common boards, are they socialized in the same place, and stuff like that. There's Back Ersten, who's much looking at revolving doors, so people going back and forth. That's very similar. Hjelmar and Lena Holm Pedersen and Also Rasmussen has many interests, but particularly Hjelmar and Pedersen, they've been interesting in this idea of, is being a minister a stepping stone or rather a closed door? It does work like an eel trap that closes the career possibilities for later. So they're kind of looking at this democratic issue of whether it's hard to have a career after a political after having been in office. And they find kind of different findings, much depending on exactly which group they're looking at. Do they look at ministers? Do they look at ministerial advisors? Do they look at members of parliament? Depends a little bit on methods and time period and so on. But there are lots of very good studies. But therefore, generally for very short periods of time, very recent periods of time. Then here in Sweden, you have all the work done by Stefan Svalfors and Anna Thurström and several, and also what you're planning on doing, particularly, as you know, on policy professionals, discrete elites, but maybe not so much on the elected politicians. So that's kind of where we come in to be complementary. In Norway, Jostein, who I'm working with, he has worked a lot on ministerial advisors, but not really on the elected politicians. So as they are somewhat lower in the hierarchy and more discreet, there are kind of other mechanisms for circulation than the ones on the top, the ministers who are most in the media, have very clear political profiles and so on. Okay, so you could say that one major gap is that there aren't any studies of how these mobility patterns have changed over time. There are some major societal transformations have taken place over the last 60 years. We can talk about the professionalization of politics. One could maybe expect that people tend to stay in politics more than they used to. We have this idea of social democrats working in regular jobs and then going into politics, and maybe they go back to the jobs afterwards. Is that something? You could also say that the big changes is what the state own and control into a more pluralist society within telecom, media, railway, etc. Maybe that has some consequences on where people go after having been a minister. Also privatization of big state companies, and the fact that things are put on the stock market. Also the technical transformations of a media. Media is something very different today than when it was what it was in the 60s. Does that have consequences for what kind of professions that politicians go into? And of course, for Norway, the extreme enrichment. In the 60s, the oil wasn't found yet, whereas now it's something very, very different. So one could expect that this also might have consequences for the types of careers that politicians have. So what are the implications? Do they increasingly stay in politics? Is it rather more mobility of time? There are also some hypotheses, much in both in social science and in the media, about how they collude, they go together. Well, we should check that empirically. In what direction do they go when they migrate to other sectors? To what industries? Are there changes in this over time? When they change sector, do they obtain positions of power or not? Yeah, so that's some major things. In elite sociology, there's been some very interesting studies about the kind of institutions that function as selection mechanisms and that shape elites, right? And in much studies of European societies, it's very much about elite educational institutions like the École Normale d'Administration in France or Oxford and Cambridge in Britain and so on. And we've always been saying that in the Nordic countries, it's not exactly that kind of educational institution, maybe slightly more so in Sweden than in Norway, but still. And then it's been interesting, and that's what Ellerskog and Larsen have done, trying to look at, are there maybe other types of organization that play this role as selection and mechanisms for elite positions? So that's interesting. And in these other European countries, Michael Hartmann, Mattei Dogen, there are other key elite sociology scholars that have worked on particular elite configurations or particular institutional structures that kind of shape the connections between sectorial elites in different countries, such as in France, the École nationale d'administration, and also the way the corps, the administrative corps in public administration are organized. They have structural things that facilitate mobility between public sector, between like administrative positions, elected positions, and the private sector in ways that we don't have in Norway, for instance. But are there other institutional structures that favor particular elite configuration in the Nordic countries, or in this case in the Norwegian countries? So one could look at that, whereas we're not really looking at the institutions that select and shape, but rather at the institutions where elite go to exert the power. And there are some points on convergence there with what you do when you look at the discrete elites or think tanks and stuff like that, right? So where are the institutions where people go, people that we assume already have power, where they go to? So that's why we ask the second question: can the political elites' mobility patterns be interpreted as indications of the institutional structures in which power is exerted? But that's up for discussion. We would have to assume that political elites actually hold power, and that the institutions they go to are the ones that they wish for, which we can't, of course, know. Maybe that's just the last resort, but we'll come back to that. Yeah. And also, in what way do Norwegian institutional structures of power exertion change over time? And also, are there any specific patterns along party lines, or at least party blocks, and have these changed? So we map the careers of ministers 5 years following the departure of a cabinet. It would have been great, of course, to code the entire careers. We have in this project favored, because many look at very short periods of time but do very extensive work on that. We have favored a very long period of time but look at only 5 years. When we chose 5 years, it's because it's just more than one electoral period, so that for those who after an election, having been minister, they go back to be a member of parliament for 4 years, and then after that we can look if they go into another job. We also thought that maybe the first job you have after having been minister might be like a waiting job, and then it's only after a year or two that you actually go into the job that really reflects your possibilities. And you could also argue that a job that you get like 15 years after your ministerial spell might not be that much about having been a minister. It might be about what you've done afterwards. Well, this is of course unclear, but anyway, we made that choice. So we've built an original database based on official records on politicians in Norway, LinkedIn, lots of various sources, open sources. We've recorded all the ministerial careers in this time period. So according to sector, industry, the role, are they owners, just employers, C-suite level, so like a leader, a certain level of leadership, what size of the organization into which they go, and the duration of their employment. Yeah, so position 5 years. We look at the one they've had for the longest time within those 5 years. Oh no, we look at no, we don't. We look at all the positions they've had in those 5 years, and each departure from a ministerial spell is counted as one line, one career. So that means that each minister can have several lines, right? So it's not that many. It's not a huge N, but it's the entire population, right? So there is nothing about significance or not. It's all of them. So right. So this is just the various governments from Borten to 65 to 69 and all the way through Solberg. We had to stop at Solberg. So the Social Democrats that are now, we were, for purely research reasons, we were hoping that the right would get the election on Monday so that we could start interview them. But well, we'll have to live with that. Anyway, it's fun when it's not just numbers, but it's real people. You know who the people are, the ones that we look at, because we all know. We'll have to go more into that in the paper, but we know that the 80s were a period of and the early 90s were a period when much happened with the state monopolies and dismantling of the state monopolies. So did things happen then, for instance? The oil started here. stuff like that. So it's interesting to see were there changes. So just to sum up the key findings, I'll go into detail. We'll look at where do they go according to sector. Is it change over time? Differences between party blocks, mobility according to industry and type of organizations, and do they enter positions of power, what we call C-suite positions? Yeah. Okay. So first of all, we can see as kind of this is not over time, right? This is the average for entire time period. So as you can see, the large majority stay in politics. However, this adds up to more than 100 because people just both stay in politics and acquire a position outside over the years, right? So it's interesting to see that although a large majority stay in politics, rather significant.
Sorry, question clarification there. So
yeah.
It adds up to more than 100% because you have many lines. You can over this time period, it can be several.
No. This is 70. For instance, this is 67% of the lines. Mm-hmm. So that's not about that, but it's the fact that they can have multiple jobs in the 5 years that we study. Mm-hmm. So if they have been in politics in those 5 years, that will come out here. But if they have also been in the public sector, that will come here, and if they've also been in the private sector, right. So the fact that it goes well beyond 100 means that there is much hybridity, that people have combined careers, that they go into different types of positions. It's not either or. So that's a finding in itself, right? And it is interesting to see that even though many stay in politics, it's quite a significant proportion that go into other sectors. 33 in public sector, 23 in private sector, and 18 in, well, civil society. We have we're still discussing the term to use, but this includes the labor unions and the employee unions and so on, right? Which is important. We'll come back to that.
And where do you put NATO?
NATO is in civil society. Actually, it is an international non-governmental organization, okay. Right? Yeah. So you can see that the center right tend to go more into private sector than the left Labour bloc, right? So there's a difference that the left Labour tend to go more into public sector than the right bloc, on average, which is as expected, right? But still, the interesting thing is, how does this evolve over time? Yeah. So large majority of politicians continue in politics. Yeah, this is what we've said.
And a difference in civil society?
Yeah, you see the leftists go more often into civil society than the rightists. Yeah, but this is the average over time for the entire period. Yeah. Here are the evolution over time. So the elected office is the purple one here. You can't really say that there's a clear trend here, right? The thing is that it's kind of luring because the points are the elections, so the lines between the points don't really mean anything, right? But still, it gives an image of it. So but you can't really say that there's which is interesting. It's kind of counterintuitive to the professionalization thesis. They stay in politics they stayed in politics as much here than they do today, and the other way around. Anyway, so the red is the public sector. It's not huge, but you can see that there's a decrease over time in the transitions to the public sector, and there is a slight increase over time in the transitions to the private sector. Not so marked, but still. So, the NGO is slightly more difficult. So the public sector has employed fewer and the private sector more departing ministers over time. And this is for both, for all the cabinet members, right? The public-private gap, there was a gap here, particularly. It began to close in the early 80s, and it was rather close here, but at the end there is a bigger gap, and that's the far-right minister, the Progress Party ministers that very much went into the private sector. It will be interesting when the current government at some point have to give over power to the others. When they go up, where do they go? Is this will the leftists also go more to the private sector, or will there be a gap again between the two? Here are the partisan patterns for going into the public sector. Let's see, there's the public sector and that's the private sector. So what you can see is that there is a reduction in the post-ministerial employment in the public sector for both blocks. Both the rightist and the leftist go less and less into public sector. It's not huge, but it's still somewhat. However, maybe the private sector employment is more interesting. The partisan gap narrowed in the 90s, right? So there is a notable increase in leftist minister going to the private sector. So I think that's a significant thing about social democracy in the Nordic countries and so on, that the biggest change when it comes to going into the private sector are the leftist minister going more into the private sector in this particular period of time. And then there is a slight decrease, but it's not very much. And then you have the Progress Party ministers going more into the private sector. Yes?
Just a point of clarification on the end. How big is an average-sized Norwegian cabinet?
Yeah.
So what is
yes. Of course, this is a very important question. Actually, it's also methodologically a bit tricky because they may have been like, I don't remember now, but maybe 15 something here and 25 here. So it's also about some methodological issues here. That because here 1 or 2 ministerial departures makes a big difference in the data. Absolutely.
Following up on that, another thing, is there during this period a significant change in the size of the private sector as compared to the public sector, the privatizations and things like that?
Well, I don't have the numbers for like money wise, but one of the things that we've looked very specifically into is, can the increase in private sector enterings be explained by the public sector companies becoming private?
Exactly.
No, they can't.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. For various reasons, this can be coded in many ways, but anyway, we've tried so many versions of the coding, and it doesn't explain the rise here. Yeah.
Just last clarification. All these state-owned companies like Telenor and Veritas, the Norske Veritas, and Statoil, and are these private sector or public sector? Yeah.
So this is also one of the things that we've been discussing so much, and with lots of other colleagues and people do this kind of differently. We have coded Statoil as a public sector company until it was, how do you say that in English? Satt på børs, put on the stock market. So even though today it is primarily owned by the state, it's now counted as a private because it has a legal status as a private company. Whereas Hydro, for instance, it was originally a private company, and then it was state-owned for a while, and then it was private. So we're coding it as private when it was private, and state-owned when the state company when it was, and then when it became publicly listed on the Oslo Stock Exchange, it is counted as a private company. Yes, and these things are really complicated. You have to think through, but we have. The main thing is that we have, in the paper, it's of course written with much precision, but it corresponds to what I'm saying now. But we have tried to calculate with various, and it doesn't really change this main pattern. So when these leftist ministers increasingly go to the private sector, it's not huge, right? So it's not, but it is significant. It is not simply because we count Statoil as a private company. It is because they start to go to real private companies or more classical private companies. Yeah. Yeah. This we're not sure whether we should keep this or not in this particular paper. We're thinking about it. We tried to find a way to code. I'm not sure if it's best, but it's something. We coded the industries for those who go into the private sector. Where do they go? And we coded it into primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary sectors. And so the primary sectors are the red ones, the secondary, the blue ones, the tertiary, the green ones, and the quaternary, the purple ones. So as you know, we don't have much industry in Norway. So the secondary sector is very low. But when people go into oil, agriculture, fishery, and oil and fishery are the two big money makers, right? It's the red sector. But the political elites, when they went into the private sector, they very much went into tertiary, so service sector, service positions, and knowledge-oriented. But there is a literature on this, so we didn't make it up. But there is a literature saying that there's been a growth of what we call the quaternary sector, which is consultancy work, think tanks, that kind of positions. And so you kind of say that there has been a growth of a particular kind of industry, and it's kind of taking over, right? That's where they go, particularly at the expense of the tertiary sector. We have to do this for the public sector too. We haven't done it. Because a lot also went into like not a lot, but I mean some people go into teaching, and so they could be it could be interesting to combine them. We'll see. Okay, so then next question: do they, when they go into other sectors, do they obtain positions of power? This can also, I'm not sure if it kind of settles the question, but it's still it kind of gives an indication whether when they migrate to other sectors, is it option of last resort, or is it what they actually want? Are they wanted? Are these success stories? Well, if they get positions of power, it might be an indication of success stories. So does ex-ministers' attainment of leading positions vary between occupational sectors and between the left and the right bloc? Well, of all the career trajectories, 42% included at least one C-suite position in all of these. But if we exclude the ones who exclusively remained in politics and only look at the ones who've actually gone over to another sector, then 66% get into C-suite positions. That's a lot. So if you look at the question, is being a minister a closed door, an eel trap, or rather a stepping stone? It works pretty well as a stepping stone. They really get into positions of power also in other sectors. C-suite is either CEO or the immediate leadership positions under that. But the point was that we'd rather use that than, for instance, count everyone with the title directeur, because directeur can be a lot, particularly in the public sector and stuff like that. So it's a way to really look at only the top management positions in companies, and both private and public sector, right? It's actually almost identical for leftist and rightist ministers. So the rightists are not in general more prone to C-suite positions. But the proportion was higher for the leftists in the 60s and 70s, and then it's been rather equal later on. So that's a change over time. There's a somewhat higher C-suite proportion in the public sector compared to civil society and the private sector. We'll look at that on here. This is the public sector, this is the private sector. You see the blue is the rightist and the red the leftist. So particularly in the private sector, you can see that there was a gap, but the gap has closed. Yes, sorry, did you have a question behind there? No, you were just stretching your arms, that's fine. Yes, please, yeah.
Are these people, the power elites, are they typically being headhunted? Or do you know that? Or are they sort of the fortune of a...
Yeah, we can...
Very well.
Okay, so the obtained public sector C-suite position was highest among the lefties in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The gap closed in the 1990s. Until the end of the 90s, the attainment of C-suite positions in the private sector was higher among ministers from the right. And yeah, around the 2000, the gap was closed. And then we'll just finally look at the C-suite obtainment of C-suite positions in the NGOs. So yeah, very big. There are so few, so these numbers are kind of problematic. Very few observations, but yeah, you can see here that the C-suite proportion far higher among rightists than the leftists. But there are very few ministers from the right that are interested in working in civil society unless they can obtain a managerial role.
But here you included NATO.
Yeah.
So Stoltenberg is here somewhere.
Yeah, actually I think that's something that we didn't bring into this, that I haven't put in here, but we also found, which is interesting, looking at the bigger picture here of structural changes and partisan affinities, is that we see that the leftist ministers, when they went into NGOs, they tended to go into the labor unions, but that has changed since the late 90s, beginning of 2000. Now they are very much going into employer organizations. So there is still the tripartite structure, but with a slight change of affinities. Okay, so I'll work my way close to towards the end here. So to sum up, there's 2/3 of departing ministers that continue in politics, but only 1/3 exclusively so. Most departing ministers find work outside politics, so we could say that it's rather a stepping stone than a closed door. The public sector has employed fewer and the private sector more departing ministers over time. The block differences in public versus private post-ministerial occupations were considerable up till the 90s and have since largely disappeared. So the rightist and the leftist ministers tend to become more similar. That is a significant thing. A surprisingly high proportion obtain C-suite roles, leftists as well as rightists. So that's kind of the simple descriptive aspect, and then over to the more speculative side. So the degree to which ex-ministers find positions of power outside politics seem to have been rather stable over time. There is no big change when it comes to what degree they go into positions of power in other sectors, which is kind of contrary to an expectation of increasing professionalization of politics, for instance, but also contrary to an expectation of increasing circulation, increasing blending, increasing concentration of power. It's more stable. However, it is interesting that the attractivity of the public sector is somewhat declining and the attractivity of the private sector somewhat increasing among ex-ministers if we assume that they obtain the positions that they want. So this is kind of in line with the expectation that we could have with the dismantling of the state monopolies, privatization, pluralization, and so on. Although, as I said earlier, it cannot be simply explained by the fact that some major public companies became private. It's a broader change in the entire public-private relationship and in the way the big organizations are owned and organized today. So maybe we could talk about a subtle shift of power between sectors and organizations. We could also say that there is an increase in the migration to quaternary sector, so these think tanks, lobbying, PR, etc., at the expense of the tertiary sector, an indication of a development of a new labor market where two political elites go to exert power. This could also be in line with expectations related to liberalization, privatization, transformation of the media landscape, right? And there is a decreasing difference between party blocks, which also has some. We can't say anything about that from here, but we can assume that this is also relevant to the voters, that these careers says something about the identities, the profiles of the ministers, right, and what kind of institution they're attached to, and we can expect that that has something to do, has something to say for the voters. Right, that's it, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're getting into the question and answer period. And if you're here in person, you put up a hand for a new question, but we also take follow-ups, and then you put up a finger. And online, you use the chat to send in your name and also please your area of study, because we like to file questions from different fields. So, for example, Gustav, philosophy. And same with follow-up, then you write follow-up and to the person you follow up. Very well. So I think we already had a question during the period. So that's Andreas, I think, and there will be a microphone coming.
Thank you very much. My name is Andreas Churling. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Gävle within occupational health. My question to you, first of all, thank you for the presentation. My question to you, are these C-suits, are they typically being recruited or are they applying? And are there any certain positions within ministerials that are more likely to be recruited if you're Minister of Defense, Minister of Education, and so on and so forth?
Yes, those are very interesting questions.
Thank
Can
you.
I reply directly? Or
Yes,
yeah.
of course.
First of all, we don't have data on those issues from this. We do, however, have interviews with a lot of ministers where we've asked them questions a bit about this, and interestingly, many of them refuse to talk about this. The ones who talk about this talk about how hard it is. Many of them talk about how they have absolutely no plan for what to do when they go out. They are like fully busy with being a minister till the second they hand over the key, and suddenly the world falls down for them. They don't have a driver, they don't have any responsibility, the media, they're really sad. They're living it as a hard time. Yeah.
It's called backpacker's hangover.
Yeah, ministerial hangover. And this is actually in accordance with some of what Lena Holm Pedersen and her colleagues found, that they experience it as really hard. However, I find it interesting that the data here shows that it's not that hard. So there might be an interesting difference between the subjective experience of the thing and their objective possibilities of actually getting a job. This is probably a time thing, that it's very hard at once, recently after, but that it works out rather well, rather quickly. However, there are interesting international comparisons with it. We see that I work with a colleague in France, Lola Avril, who's done interviews with French ministers, and she works together also with a Finnish colleague who's working on Finnish minister. And for the French, they see that they have an exit plan from the moment they're recruited as minister. So they plan their career. So there are some traditions here. They have this, and I think that's related to the fact that French politicians go back and forth between administrative and elected positions. So they used to try and plan years ahead. The Norwegians don't do that, but they tend to figure it out. There was another part of the question that I've forgotten, I think. I don't remember now.
Yes, are there any ministers that are more prone to be recruited?
Yeah, no,
than
we don't have data on that, but we could, but we haven't found, because there are so few. That's right there. But we've seen other studies on it, and it's rather interesting. In Denmark, at least, it's rather interesting. Yeah, it's for slightly bigger groups, not only ministers, but also people from other, like ministerial advisors, statssekretærer, and so on. And maybe counter to what you could expect, it's not the ones for the Minister of Finance, the most heavy ministries that more easily go into top positions in the private sector. It's rather the ones from minor ministry, likestillingsdepartementet and so on. But that's probably because the one from the top positions tend to stay in politics, whereas the one in slightly lower positions need to go elsewhere. Going into the private top position in the private sector might be great, but it's not necessarily what they primarily wanted. Maybe they primarily wanted to stay in politics, right? So, yeah, there was another.
Oh, I find the questions.
Yeah.
Anna.
Thank you. I obviously have great interest in this. So a few comments, and then a recommendation, and then a question. So I didn't find, maybe that's where I'm coming from, like the 66% going into C-suite is not that surprising to me, actually, because they've been head of huge government departments, like hundreds of people. So, I mean, leadership is kind of a skill they have, and that they go into management of organizations. That said, I think Gustav's point, like the size of public expenses over GDP, is an important part of the background story. In Sweden, this has been declining. So like the whole society has become more private, even when it's tax financed. So then that's the natural way of organizing things. So like I know that you said these companies are as many of these are listed on the stock exchange, but the states still have huge stakes in them. So it's a reorganization of society. And that's the background story. So judging of that is not so surprising. The recommendation is this, like the leftist politicians going from trade organizations into employer organizations. That's a fascinating story. Yes. And I think you could do something specifically on that, because like how like the employer organizations are attracting these people over time. And that's a huge transformation of welfare state careers. My question is, I'm not an elite scholar from the beginning, so this might be because of my lay understanding of circulation. But for me, circulation is like more than one move. So it's a circle. So I was wondering, and you say that there's hybridity, but it's in a table. Like, do you have information on the length of stints? And do you see if many people have moved several times between different sectors? Because that would actually speak to this kind of nestedness of different elites. Can you see if there's an increase in my understanding of circulation, that is people moving between spheres, hybridity?
Anna, can you precise my question? Do you mean circulation that they can go between different many sectors, or is it enough that they go back and forth between two sectors?
Both, but like the different sectors, just like one move from one sector. We had Odd Engström, who moved into Kinnevik in 1990, but he stayed there.
Stoltenberg, so we can
but Stoltenberg is coming back. Yeah. But we had these people, Björn Rosengren, they moved out. They just stay there. They become corporate animals. But do we have these people who move between NGOs, between politics, and between corporate sector, for example? Like, do you have that kind of? Because in interlock studies, we can see that the average stint of a CEO has gone down from 12 years to 3 years or something the past 40 years. So we tend to stay shorter in jobs. That was long.
No. Yeah. No, great comments. I just take note of the thing about making more out of the trade unions and because I agree. So we're planning on that. I agree that it might not be surprising, but it's still lots of variation in the findings in the literature. So just stating it has some value in the Nordic debate, at least on this, I'd say. My aim, but I must say I'm struggling a little bit with how to delimit the kind of transformations of the society that I'll take into the introduction and the research context to kind of lay out some expectations. So, but I agree, the size of the public sector is important. However, of course, Norway is a bit different than from many other countries due to the oil fund. We have so much money, so the public sector is still very big. But interestingly, it's still very big, and still you have exactly the same transformations as in other countries with privatization and so on. So it's an interesting case actually, and particularly in a Nordic comparison. So we'll make more out of that. When it comes to the circulation issue, to me it is interesting to just look at one move too. But I agree that more moves are also very interesting and additionally interesting. I haven't done anything out of it here. We do have data on it, but I can't sum it up now here. But we do have both data on whether they go back and forth and on the length. However, since it's 5 years, it's not that much. Probably, I mean, if we did code the entire, we wanted to do like a sequence analysis of the entire careers, but since we did this choice of doing from the 65 up till today, we haven't had the time to do that. We'll see if we can continue to work on it in the future. I agree that when you go back and forth, there is more the likelihood of interfering or bringing things with you, or is higher. But at least for even even though it's maybe for a short period of time, when you do one move, be it from the private to the public or public to the private, it still is possible to impact. And many of those we talk about say that this is, which is actually, it's both an argument for studying just what happens in a short period of time, but also if they go back and forth to look at that, because it's in the beginning that they influence the most, right? Because that's when they have network and so on, and after a while it fades out, and yeah. So, but I'll just. Yeah, we have no. Yeah, they tend to stay rather long. But of course, there are lots who have like waiting jobs. So we actually wanted to maybe write a paper only on the waiting jobs, that you go into first house, the PR company and so on, just till you get elected again, right? So you have to be somewhere and earn some money if you're not in parliament. Like right now, there are lots of rightist or MPs that they have lost so much. There are so many people who counted on being MP and they're not elected. So what are they going to do? You know, so they just have to find a job. And what we see in the from studies of the commissioners at the European level, there's a lot more people who are struggling, and they start private consultancy companies, right? So it looks like they have consultancy work, and it looks like they have an important position, but it's just their own thing that they're doing to survive while they're waiting for a real job for some of them. So, yeah, there are various.
We have lots of questions here, so let's move to political science and Ludwig. And let me just, maybe Ludwig can answer this question. One thing I wonder about, like, if you've been in the parliament for a number of years in Sweden, you get a kind of a pension.
Yeah.
And I guess you have a similar system in Norway, and that works as a
Yep.
kind of buffer. And you were talking about waiting.
Yep.
How does it work in Norway?
Yeah, no, of course, there are some. It's not that long, but you have some ventelønn. Yeah, for a while, but I don't remember now.
That would be kind of
and
not being so stressed out.
Yeah, of course, for a year or something. I think it's max a year. But it's not like the French, for instance, who have it for life and chauffeurs and everything. It's a while, but you have to actually get a job at some point.
And Ludwig, how is it in Sweden? I mean, it depends on how long you've been in parliament.
Yeah, and they changed it recently, so it's much more difficult for the members of the parliament. They get much shorter time for payment, and they have to qualify for a longer period in the parliament until they get a real.
And how long is it? 6 years? Or 3 years?
Yeah, something like that.
But still, that should be a little bit of a buffer. Also, a way of avoiding this problem. But anyway.
Right. So yes, thanks for an excellent presentation. This is very interesting. I actually had a project myself 20 years ago about the ministerial backgrounds of the Swedish ministers, and so it's a topic that I really find interesting. But two very sort of minor questions that I had, and we just for curiosity. One is, does the ministerial trajectories, the trajectories of the post-ministerial trajectories of the people you studied, does it reflect not just changes in society, as Anna was pointing to, but does it also reflect differences in the backgrounds of these ministers when they were recruited as being ministers? And I'm thinking specifically about the educational background. So in Sweden, we could see, for instance, that whereas in the 1950s and 60s, they mostly had legal training. Nowadays, it's not so common anymore. They have social science trainings. And of course, that sort of changes the careers you will pursue afterwards as well. So that's one thing that was interested in. And another question was to get some perspective on this. And that's also, I think, follow up on Anna a little bit. I mean, what is the difference here between the post office, that's something else, isn't it? The post ministerial careers of ministers compared to the post careers of members of the parliament. For instance. I mean, surely they are more elite in a way, but both of them are both members of the parliament and members of the cabinet are both sort of part of the parties and part of the political sector. I mean, is there is it a strong difference here between them, or is it just that they do like all politicians do when they stop being politicians? Yeah,
both questions are very interesting. First, to start with the second one, we don't have data on all those here for the entire period of time, but there are other studies in Norway for shorter periods of time. that seem to show that it's easier for the ministerial advisors, at least, than for ministers. When it comes to the members of parliament, there is this woman, Marte Mangset, who's a PhD scholar at the Department of Sociology. She has compared those groups, but for a much shorter period of time. I don't remember now whether she said the members of parliament, but but there are some studies saying that it's sometimes slightly more difficult for ministers, as in Denmark they've shown that, because they have so-called political cargo. They have a too visible profile, so that a company doesn't necessarily want to associate with a party that clearly. But if you take someone working more in the shadows, it's easier. They will both have the competence of the system, but be less of a flashlight. Yeah, so there are some differences there. We don't have the comparative data there, unfortunately, but some of these other studies should suggest that it was harder for ministers, and we would say that it doesn't seem that hard for ministers. On the other hand, the ministers have the highest management experience, and some of the ones we interviewed talked about that even though it's obviously not the same to run a minister than to run a company, because in the minister the bureaucracy are obliged to do what you say, but still it's a big organization. So going from that to leading a public agency, for instance, it's they feel the transition is not that big. So that was one thing. But when it comes to the changes in backgrounds, for the time being we haven't connected these data with the data of the Path to Power group, but we are in the process of doing that, where we'll look at the background and look at specifically those questions. However, there are some preliminary studies published in the book that I looked at, Regjeringen. There is one chapter on the backgrounds of the ministers, and also in the article that I've published in the there's a special issue related to the elections of the journal Tidsskrift for Statsvitenskap, where there's a paper on the ministerial personnel. And when we look at particularly this, both the level of education and the kind of education, and actually in the book we look at the educational level from the 1800s up till today. And interestingly, I mean, the level of education among ministers is decreasing, right? Whereas, so related to the question of the politicians as an educational elite or knowledge elite, we're saying that, yeah, of course they do have in average a higher level of education than the public, but the gap between the public and the ministers is closing in compared to what it was in 200 years ago. And of course we see this, they're going from being legal scholars to social scientists and so on, but that's also because the types of the disciplines that are on offer have changed, and being a legal scholar was being a generalist. Today, being a social science scholar is being a generalist. So whether that has consequences for the kind of jobs that you can have, it's hard to say. But anyway, we'll look into the specific patterns, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Happy with that, Ludwig. Then we move on to Mats.
Thank you very much. So first, just one kind of short question about clarification, I suppose. So when you talk about careers here, that's in your C-suite positions, what are you including then? Are you including all sources of income they gain from, or is it only their kind of main?
It's only the position, the formal job position.
So you're not including board memberships, for example?
No, we've discussed that a lot.
Because that could be quite a significant.
Yeah, we have data
power,
on the board membership, but we don't, because what we do it when it's a full-time, or no, not necessarily full-time, but when it's I don't remember how the cutoff is here, but yeah, at least when a when you're head of board as a full-time occupation, then it's a position. But no, when lots of these people have board membership, and then we're not counting it. We would have loved to look at income. To me, it's really, really sad that we're not looking at income. But for instance, this Marte Mangset that we talked about, she looks at income, but she uses registered data. So she has the anonymous data, right? She can't connect it to the actual people. We have data on each actual person, but then we don't know what they earn because we don't have access to, that's not accessible data.
So styrelseproffs, so to speak, they won't be counted. It's not unusual here in Sweden to
Yeah. No, no, not when there are many small board things that, when they have one big, yes.
Because that would be very interesting to see also the shift from public to private, if there is such.
Yes.
So my other question was regarding, and this relates, I suppose, to what Gustav has been asking about NATO, internationalization.
Yeah.
Is that something you tracked? Is that something you could see? Because it wasn't part of your categories, but I mean, EU, NATO, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have data on that. We didn't put it up now because there are so few. We've really struggled in looking at the kind of organization that people go into, and it's so hard to categorize, because is it about the money, how the spendings, it's about the size, is it national or not? And there are, I mean, people go into these small organizations at local level and become the head of scouts, or I don't know, they do so many things. So we ended up actually only categorizing international and national, because even among the national, the variation is so huge. There can be national organizations that are very. So we have data on the international, but there are so few, it was impossible to make a graph. So yes, there is Stoltenberg, but I mean, there are so few. And you must remember that Norway is not part of EU.
Yes,
so
that was one reason why I asked, because I think in Sweden is a quite important part that you move between EU and
so sure, there are, I mean, it's actually rather fascinating to look at how Norway has put lots of people in the EU system without being an EU member, but it's not the kind of position not the kind of formal position that you have when you're part of EU, right? So it's not a career road. It's for smaller fish, because they're kind of looking at the shadows and trying to compensate for not being for you. But you can't put a minister in that kind of position; it would be too visible. So.
So just so I understand, so the ones in private sector, that's in the Norwegian private sector, or could that also be if they move to Sweden
international?
Or to,
yes, absolutely, yes.
Because that would make a difference for the question of whether they are using their power, right? Because if they exercise power in the Norwegian cabinet, that wouldn't really be, or perhaps not a factor if they move to UK or perhaps even Sweden to be in the private sector. It's not as much of an obvious worry, at least. Yeah,
but I must really stress that we do not say that we measure whether they use power. We just do the empirical work that later on could be used in further studies of whether they exert power or not. But I agree, it's a very interesting. And so it could be nice to actually set up which part go into international companies and went to national. Even though I suppose it's kind of difficult also to distinguish those two. I mean, I don't know. What counts as an international company? You can have a Norwegian company with an international reach, and I don't know. For, let's say, again, fish farming is so important now. They sell fish to China. That's what they do. That's. But it might be a nationally registered company, but their main market is China. So, is it interesting that it's a national? Well, maybe, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so Tim, you have both a main question and a follow-up question.
No, I switched my hand to a follow-up.
You still have a hand if you want.
So, my question is related to Matt's first question. I think based on the exchange that you just had, I might be able to infer what your answer is. But I was going to ask about the breakdown of positions within the C-suite and whether you have, sort of kept track of the specific positions within that area, because I don't know if it's the same in Norway as it is in the United States, but in the United States context, so the C-suite can include positions that I would think of as involving real substantial power over the direction of a company. And then other positions where the power is much more narrow, and then still others that count as what are sometimes called vanity titles, where the person doesn't really have any real power. I mean, chief sustainability officer is a thing I've heard in some cases like that.
We don't have any sustainability officers in this group, I can assure you.
But the idea is just that the specific positions can matter. And it might help to have an idea of that, because it could be the difference between people in government moving to positions of real decision-making power versus just getting like a cushy job, right? That maybe involves high pay, maybe it doesn't, but they're not, really involved too much in shaping the. I mean, all of this is really. It would be nice if you had a measure, some kind of measure of power that were independent.
That would be nice. I agree.
But you already said that you don't have that, so.
Kind of a general problem in elite studies, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose that's why also, for instance, Egerod does this work on his revolving door studies, where he's writing on an article now a chapter actually, I think, where he really goes into what kind of mechanisms is it possible to measure. But there are lots of assumptions in that kind of work too, but I agree that it's very fascinating. There will be assumptions in this kind of elite studies, and to look at the mechanism, you should probably need both quantitative but also much qualitative work, right? To look at whether, and even though there are methodological issues to that too. So we can't do it with it, but I agree. It would be nice. Maybe we'll find a way to follow up. But anyway, I just take note to be more specific about the C-suite. I don't remember the exact titles now, but I can assure you there are no sustainability officers in here. I've worked a lot on gender in business before, so I know the type. Anyway, the point here is again that there are so few people that we can't have two small categories, right? And when we decided to use the C-suite category based on much literature that uses this, it's an established category, it was a way to get out a lot of seemingly managerial positions that are actually without power. So it was already a way to get those out. It's possible that there are still some in there. I'll look more into it. But the ambition was exactly to avoid what you're talking about and only have people with some kind of power. Of course, you have to discuss what kind of power is it. I suppose it depends as much on the type of company as the position within the company too. But I don't know. Yeah, but I'll look more specific.
Contextual differences too.
What did you say?
I was saying there might be contextual differences too, depending on not only the type of organization, but also you mentioned that you're counting people who got jobs overseas. Maybe one country is different from another, and so forth.
There are contextual issues. I think that the French would say that Stoltenberg had no power. He was just a puppet for United States, and that was why he was chosen in the first place. But the Norwegians would of course say that he has immensely power. Anyway, yeah.
Emma.
So I have a methodological question.
Yeah. As you maybe understand, I'm not the statistical person here, so but I've been discussing the categories and the works with them for months and months.
I'm very interested in the topic, but then I'm a little bit conspicuous about this sort of qual aspect. And then if you would only say this is based on interviews, here's what I have inferred from those, then I would buy it. But now you show this time series, and then my quant mind triggers. And then when you use terms like difference between groups or increase, there are statistical ways to measure that, right? And when I see these time series, I would say maybe there isn't a difference between the groups. Maybe there isn't an increase or a decrease from a statistical point of view.
It's not significant.
It's not significant.
But it's the total of the population. It's not
okay. But
right. It's all the people. But so significance is not.
But if there is a time series, if there is an increase over time, and the dots are a bit like this, then you can make a line. You can fit the line.
It is problematic. I agree.
But you're still saying that your use of the words increase and decrease and difference between groups, they work for this type of data, or is it a quantitative?
I would absolutely like to stress this fact that there are so few people that that we measure the points of careers after a point of exit, right, and elections and so on. So the lines are kind of they're just to show so that it's easier to see. It's the points in time, right? There are actually exit points of, but. Yeah, and I agree that the differences are not huge, particularly for instance, the rise of the leftist ministers going into private sector for a certain period of time. It's not huge. However, since it's not proportions of, it's the totality. It's as many as you see, So it's not something where you have to evaluate whether is this within the margin of error or something, right? It's the number that you see. These are all the people.
I mean, at one point in time, I totally agree. One number is higher than the other number.
Yes.
But if it's, if it fluctuates.
Yeah, absolutely. Like sure. Can I go back on this, or is that a problem? Since no. Let's go back to, for instance, that's one is hopeless, but not the C-suite, but for instance, this one. So. These are the red are the leftist, and the right are and the blue are the rightist in the public sector, and those are the leftists and the rightists in the private sector. Sure, this is few people and hard numbers to interpret. So there are lots of doubts and insecurity about this. I totally agree. I would say that there has been a slight decrease, a decrease in public sector appointment between the 60s and today, even though there is some variation, is not a very risky interpretation of this. And it's more problematic here, but to say that there has been some gap between the leftists and the rightists, a gap which closed a bit in these years and then widened slightly again, I wouldn't say that's a very risky interpretation either. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that's problematic?
I mean, I don't want to make a statement about this, but
I'm interested to hear.
If you do a sort of time series analysis, there may be some more other findings than what's like. This is graphical, right? Like I can see it with my own eyes.
Do you think that there are methodological issues that could explain the variations that you see?
Yeah, I mean, there's a random variation in everything.
Yeah,
right?
And absolutely, since there are so few people, I mean, just a couple of persons will make a difference, and then, is that really a trend? Yeah. Absolutely. Very problematic,
You can compare some kind of random walk and see if you get a difference. What you would expect if you just have some kind of random walk on it. Mm. So that would be a possibility, I guess. But you're the pro.
Yeah.
No, join me and thank Marte for this very interesting talk.
Thank you so much for the questions and comments, and I really will take them with me when we work further on the paper. Thank you.
Very good. And there's talks coming up. Our own Anandi Hattingari is going to speak on the 24th of September, Artificial General Intelligence, a Manifesto. That might be exciting. And October 1st, we have Nils Holtug. We're going to talk about identity politics and outgroup representation. He's professor in the Department of Communication at University of Copenhagen. Very welcome then.